I was elbow deep in old tractor grease, trying to figure out why the gate motor on my north fence had decided to quit on a Tuesday morning, when the sound of a high-end engine disturbed the quiet of the valley. It was the kind of engine that purrs with a sense of unearned superiority, and sure enough, a pristine, white Mercedes-Benz, the official chariot of people who have too much time and not enough problems, screeched to a halt right in front of my dirt driveway. Out stepped a woman who looked like she'd been professionally assembled in a factory for, concerned citizens, Her name was Beatrice Sterling, the self-appointed queen of the Whispering Pines HOA, and she was clutching a mahogany clipboard like it was the Ten Commandments. She didn't oppose. T offer a hello, didn't oppose. T asked how my day was. She just marched up to my grease-stained self, avoided looking at my hands as if dirt were contagious, and shoved a thick, stapled packet against my chest. Mr. Elias Thorne, I presume. She asked, her voice having that sharp, nasal quality that makes you want to apologize for breathing her air. I just wiped my hands on a rag and nodded, and she didn't oppose, to even wait for a word before launching into her scripted speech. This is an official notice of intent. We've reviewed the aesthetics of your holding, and the board has determined that this ranch is a functional blight on the community's vision for growth. We're expanding the nature preserve and the equestrian trails, and frankly, your rusted equipment and smell of livestock dawn and oppos. T-fit the luxury branding we've worked so hard to establish. You have 30 days to accept our buyout offer of $250,000 and vacate the premises. I actually had to stop and blink, wondering if I'd accidentally inhaled some exhaust fumes because this woman was standing on my ancestral land, looking at 18 acres of prime Montana soil that had been in the Thorne family since the late 1800s and offering me the price of a studio apartment in the city for it. I started to laugh, a deep belly laugh that I hadn't into oppos. T felt since my brother tried to ride a bull on a dare, and Beatrice's face turned a shade of purple that matched her expensive scarf. You're serious? I finally gasped out, Lady, this land is worth 7 figures on a bad day, and even if it was worth a nickel, I wooed in oppos. T sell it to you to build and oppos, nature trail and oppos, for people who are afraid of actual nature. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, icy slits, and she tapped her clipboard with a manicured nail, leaning in just close enough for me to smell her overpriced perfume. Dawn and oppos. TB difficult, Mr. Thorne. The HOA has resources, we have connections with the county, and we have ways of making life very, very uncomfortable for those who stand in the way of progress. You'll regret being stubborn. She turned on her heel and stomped back to her Mercedes, leaving a cloud of dust and a lingering sense of dread in the air. But what Beatrice didn't oppose, T know, what she couldn't oppose, T possibly have grasped in her little world of beige paint and lawn height regulations, was that she had just committed the ultimate tactical error. See, 15 years ago, when the developers first came sniffing around this valley to build Whispering Pines, my father was the one who sold them the development rights. But he was a shrewd old man who'd seen enough land booms to know how to protect himself. He didn't oppose, T sell the land itself. He leased it on a 99-year ground lease, meaning every single one of those, luxury estates, sat on land that still belonged to the Thorne estate. I was the landlord of their entire neighborhood, and tucked away in that lease was a, right of quiet enjoyment, clause that stated if the HOA ever harassed the primary landowner or violated local agricultural zoning, I had the legal right to terminate their occupancy and revert the land to its original state, which in this case meant a cattle pasture. The harassment didn't oppose. T take long to start, of course, because people like Beatrice Dawn oppose. T know how to lose gracefully. 3 days later, I was woken up at 6 a.m. by a loud, insistent pounding on my front door, and when I opened it, I found a trio of men in reflective vests and hard hats, led by a nervous-looking county inspector named Miller. Morning, Elias, Miller said, looking at his boots, I'm sorry about this, but we got a flood of anonymous tips about oppos, hazardous conditions oppos, on the property, illegal storage of chemicals, structural instability of the barn, and improper waste management. We have to do a full site audit. End quote. I didn't oppose. Fight them. I just grabbed a cup of coffee and followed them around with my phone camera rolling, watching as they poked at my perfectly maintained fences and sniffed at my compost pile. They spent 4 hours trying to find a single crack in the foundation or a drop of oil in the dirt, but my father taught me that a ranch is only as good as its maintenance, and they found absolutely nothing. As Miller was leaving, he pulled me aside and whispered, and quote, "Look, we know what's going on. The HOA board has been calling the commissioner's office every hour on the hour, but you're clean, Elias. I'll file the report, but I'd watch your back if I were you." End quote. I looked past his shoulder and saw that white Mercedes parked on the ridge line overlooking my valley, Beatrice sitting there with a pair of binoculars like some kind of suburban hawk. I just smiled, raised my coffee mug in a silent toast, and watched her peel away in a huff of frustration. That night, I called my old friend Julian, a man who had spent 40 years specializing in property law and who lived for the kind of chaos I was about to unleash. We sat in my kitchen, the old lease agreement spread out across the table like a map of a battlefield, and Julian's eyes lit up as he read through the fine print my father had insisted on. End quote. Elias, they really stepped in at this time. End quote. Julian chuckled, tapping a section near the bottom. End quote. Section 14C. If the lessee, that and oppose, the HOA, engages in malicious litigation or bad faith interference with a lessor and oppose, agricultural operations, the lease is subject to immediate review and potential forfeiture of all improvements. They've spent 3 days trying to prove your blight, but in doing so, they've proven they're in violation of the very contract that allows their houses to exist. End quote. We spent the next week gathering every piece of evidence. The video of the inspection, the recorded call from neighbors who admitted they were pressured by Beatrice to file complaints, and the original deed maps. But the situation took a dark turn on Friday night when the smell of acrid smoke drifted through my bedroom window. I ran outside to find a small brush fire creeping toward my hay barn, sparked by a cluster of road flares that had been tossed over my fence. If the wind had been blowing south, I would have lost everything, but luckily I managed to douse it before it took hold. When the sheriff arrived, we found a discarded gas station receipt near the fence line, and a quick check of the security footage from the town's only 24-hour stop showed the HOA treasurer, a man named Arthur Vance, buying those exact flares and a can of accelerant just an hour before the fire started. The end quote, peaceful end quote, neighborhood of Whispering Pines was about to find out that their board had been playing a very dangerous game with other people's money and lives. The sheriff didn't and oppose, mess around. They arrested Arthur Vance the next morning, and once he realized he was looking at a felony arson charge, he started talking like a leaky faucet. It turned out the HOA was and oppose. Just trying to get my land for a trail. They were broke. They had been, end quote, misplacing, end quote, the community's reserve funds for years, and Beatrice had convinced the board that if they could seize my land and flip it to a high-end developer for a new phase of construction, they could cover up the missing $500,000 before the annual audit. It was a classic Ponzi scheme wrapped in end quote, community improvement, end quote, bow. I decided it was time for a little community meeting of my own. I didn't oppose, go to the HOA office. I waited for their grand, end quote, summer gala, end quote, at the neighborhood clubhouse, a gaudy event where everyone was dressed in white linen and sipping expensive wine. I walked in wearing my work boots and denim, Julian by my side with a briefcase full of reality. Beatrice saw me and immediately tried to have me escorted out, her voice shrieking about, end quote, private property, end quote, and end quote, security, end quote, end quote. Actually, Beatrice, end quote, I said, my voice carrying across the silent room as the music stopped, end quote. This clubhouse, the pool out back, and the very dirt under your expensive sandals all belong to the Thorne estate. And as of 5 minutes ago, Julian here has filed a notice of lease termination for the entire Whispering Pines development. End quote. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence you only get right before a storm breaks. I pulled out a copy of the arson report and the financial records Arthur had surrendered. End quote. Your board tried to burn down my barn to cover up the fact that they stole your HOA fees, and because you've used the HOA and oppose, legal entity to harass me and commit a felony on my land. You are all officially in breach of the ground lease. You aren't in oppos, buying my ranch. I'm taking back my valley." End quote. The chaos that followed was beautiful in a tragic sort of way. Neighbors turning on Beatrice, the realization that their homes were legally, end quote, unhomed, end quote, because the land lease was tied to a criminal enterprise, and the sight of the sheriff walking in to lead Beatrice away in handcuffs for conspiracy and embezzlement. In the end, I didn't in oppos, bulldoze the houses. I'm not a monster, but I did dissolve the HOA entirely and replaced it with a simple land management collective where I hold the final say on any major development. The residents now pay their, end quote, fees, end quote, directly into a transparent maintenance fund, and the, end quote, nature trail, end quote, they wanted so badly? Well, it's there now, but it's a working cattle path, and once a year, they get to watch me drive my herd right past their backyards. Most of the people are actually happier now that they don in oppos. Have someone measuring their grass with a ruler. But Beatrice is still sitting in a state facility, probably trying to report the prison warden for having the wrong shade of gray on the walls. It makes me wonder, though, in a world where everyone is so obsessed with controlling their neighbor's view, why do we always forget to look at what we're actually standing on? Have you ever had a run-in with someone who thought they had power over you, only to realize you held all the cards the whole time? Does a community actually need someone in charge to be a community, or are we all just better off minding our own fences? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because in my experience, the loudest people are usually the ones with the most to hide.